Hello, hello. Oh, we're back to another Podish-Sortacast. Taking on the sort of the big topics and all that are sort of coming within the world and all that. And today we figured we might talk about something related to coping. I mean, there's many different sort of angles and dimensions to that as well. Everything from getting over some sort of personal trauma to just sort of dealing with the day-to-day news and all that. We thought it'd be worth having a discussion with a group to sort of talk about that. And with me, I've actually got two other bloggers from Free Thought Blogs with me. I'll get Sarah to introduce herself first.
Hello, I'm Sarah. I post on the Geeky Humanist blog as Dr. Sarah. Hello.
All right. And after that polite pause for everybody to say hello back, let's now bring Abe into the chat. Abe, introduce yourself.
Hi, yeah, I'm Abe. I blog at Oceanoxia, freethoughtblogs.com/Oceanoxia, sort of mostly about climate change, a lot about politics. So yeah, find me there.
Oh, cool. All right. So yeah, there are many sort of different. Oh, I also H.J. Hornbeck over at Reprobate Spreadsheet. One of these days, I will actually start blogging again. I promise. Now's not that day though. So, coping. There's again a variety of different ways we can actually sort of deal with it, and there's a variety of different types of things to cope with, and I don't think really a sort of single strategy to deal with it. There's sort of more acute sort of versions, things like PTSD and all that. But more recently, there's also been sort of a talk about something called complex PTSD, where rather than sort of have like one sort of acute trigger for any sort of distress you may have, it's actually just sort of like a series of events which sort of accumulate over time and all that. Which naturally means that it has a different symptom set, and this sort of expresses itself differently, which also implies a different way to get over it. And yeah, there's also varieties underneath the sort of the anti-coping side, such as burnout and all that, doing too much work in one specific topic and all that, and just sort of completely kind of losing out, within that as well. Um, yeah, so I suppose, are there any other examples of, sort of things like burnout and trauma now that I have sort of missed in this sort of brief introduction?
I think there's a whole range of things. I mean, you've mentioned the things toward one end of the spectrum, the various forms of PTSD, but then there's less severe but vastly more common, just the general levels of stress that I think it's hard to think of many people these days who aren't dealing with some level of stress, um, severely exacerbated by the things that go on in the world around us. And then you get the manifestations like anxiety or depression in the clinical sense.
Yeah. And yeah, there is a lot to go on as well. If you followed, my blog, for instance, I blogged quite a bit about transgender issues in the past, and I've written like dozens and dozens of articles on it, but haven't really talked about it much lately. Even though there is sort of a big sort of discriminatory push right now and all that. And some of it is just simply because a lot of what I think I would actually sort of have to say on it, I would just be sort of repeating myself, I think. It's you can't sort of write the same blog post over and over again. You've got to find ways to sort of move on and grow past things as well too. One other thing I think is worth bringing up is the concept of copium. It's maybe a little bit obscure unless you've spent a lot of time on like alt right or dirtbag left spaces and all that. But there is sort of a joy in laughing at other people's misfortune. The idea being that, like, for instance, when Donald Trump got charged with a bunch of felony counts and all that, there are probably some people sort of cheering on and going, "Aha!" Sort of
Schadenfreude.
exactly. There is, he Donald Trump is going through a crisis. People who have formed like a parasocial relationship with Donald Trump are having sort of a secondhand crisis as well too, which one of their defenses was, hey, he hasn't been charged with anything, and now suddenly he is. And there's a sort of a tendency to kind of point and laugh. I mean, this is entirely understandable. The king stumbles and stubs his toe. It's a bad thing, yes, but it's completely understandable if the peasant sort of laughs at it. people in charge got some, had some misfortune to them, happen to them. Fine. The problem, though, of course, is this really doesn't handle any sort of substantial, any sort of systematic issues or problems with it. It's a handy knee-jerk reaction, but it's something which should be just fine in small doses, I would think. I don't know what the rest of you would consider on that as well.
I think this is, when using Trump as an example, quite rightly, that is much more specific than we're getting a bit of Schadenfreude out of the misfortunes of the people in charge. For me, it depends massively on who the people in charge are, what they've actually been doing, and what the misfortune is. And in this case, of course, it's that Trump is an awful, scummy, toxic waste dump of a person who has done some very, very, very bad things, which are finally, after most of his lifetime, actually catching up with him in the form of many legal cases where he will be legally held to account according to the laws of society for the massive things that he has done wrong and the ways in which he has harmed other people. So I actually don't think that's Schadenfreude. I think it's satisfaction at justice. I think it's satisfaction at things going the way they actually should for a change. And I think it's a very positive thing for the world, bearing in mind coming events and the fact that Trump and his supporters are basically fighting to take over the USA and do God knows what to democracy.
That's
So
fair.
I think that the fact that lawsuits are now actually standing potentially in the way of them doing that is a very good and positive thing for the future of America and hence for the future of the rest of the world.
So, as I was listening to that, one thing occurred to me also, just relating to this sort of thing, is my ongoing pessimism about, well, the ability of my country to bring powerful people to any kind of actual justice. I forget who put it. I think it was like Rebecca Watson had framed it this way, but I'm not certain. But basically, whenever somebody famous dies and people talk about why isn't it Henry Kissinger, it is one of those things where in one sense, if Henry Kissinger dies tomorrow, that means he got away with it all. So it's good to see at least something happening. And I think it's a mix of the justice thing and just sort of like it is somewhat satisfying just to see such a smug and malicious person having a hard time, like anybody else would in his position had they less money. But I guess I don't know, maybe it accumulated pessimism, I think, and bleeding into despair is probably one of the things that falls somewhere into the burnout category.
Mm-hmm. Burnout is
deeply pessimistic, which frankly these days feels like being realistic. But one of my coping strategies is to not focus on that.
Well, hey, maybe we should use this as a chance to sort of get in touch, get talking about coping strategies. And certainly, it really sort of depends a little bit on what you're trying to cope with. Things like burnout have a very different strategy than say acute trauma again. I think the important thing to sort of remember, especially when it comes to things like burnout, is a lot of this is an endurance game. I'm actually very heavily influenced on this by Greta Christina. She gave a talk about a decade ago at the Secular Student Alliance on activism burnout. It's the one where she sort of had her infamous, self-care is not selfish sign and all that, if that jogs anybody's memory. But she sort of talks about, this is something that you're sort of doing for the long haul. And it's something you sort of, like, this should be your, if you're going to do this, this should be something you're able to focus on and all that. And, like, you can't run forever, people, nobody just sort of sits down and does a marathon on the spot. there's sort of like systematic training you sort of undergo to actually get used to those distances as well. And the same sort of thinking applies to dealing with things which could cause burnout. Be it a stressful situation at work, reading about the latest news from the Middle East, and so on and so forth. It's important to take those breaks, to sort of cleanse your mind and focus on something else, while still sort of leaving the door open to come back in again. Because in the long run, that's going to help you endure the entire thing a lot better.
Yeah, what comes to mind for me for burnout was my one attempt at being involved actively in an electoral campaign. There was a local campaign years ago that the guy running sort of brought me on to talk to sort of talk about climate stuff. But it ended up like with most campaigns that what he really needed was people to knock on doors. Um, and so I just ended up kind of getting pulled into normal campaign volunteer stuff, which, fair, but I that was the point at which I discovered my limits on repeated social interaction with strangers over a long period of time. And I kind of got burned out on kind of all activism for a while after that. Um, I suppose I haven't really gotten back into it as much as I ought, but I don't know. I guess guilt probably plays a role in this somewhere too.
Yeah, but
And
also
trying to
viewing
figure
it.
out.
Sorry, but also viewing
Sorry.
it as an endurance game also means that the goal is not to sort of change things immediately. Like, there is nothing I can do to bring peace to the Middle East right now. There's absolutely nothing I can do to bring that about. But if I just, blog away at it a little bit, chip away at it a little bit, maybe I can change a few minds, and gradually over time I can bring some awareness to it. I've actually, made a couple of arguments. I don't know whether or not people actually paid attention to what I was saying or somebody else thought of it independently, likely the latter. But I have actually seen people sort of use some arguments that I thought were, fairly novel that I'd never heard before. And then they come out and trot it. And, again, who knows where they got it from, but that is definitely kind of validating. And it means basically that the goal here is not to get everybody to completely change up in their lives and change to, cope with climate change, or to start petitioning or do mass protests against the major corporations that are largely responsible for creating it. It's about sort of laying the foundations for slowly chipping away at the problem and all that. You don't solve it now. You don't even necessarily solve it in a decade. But you try and take those small steps towards solving it. And this is something I've often heard of, from bloggers and all that. Like, I'm not contributing, I'm not helping and all that. Well, you are. I mean, you're not doing a major contribution, but it is a contribution of some sort. And if this truly is, something you sort of care about and are passionate about, then just keep chipping away at it, and eventually, you might make a difference, you might not. Who knows? The only way to sort of figure out is to keep trying, essentially.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I have trouble internalizing that right now is that because I spend a lot of time reading about climate change, I sort of have this ticking clock feeling thing where, I don't know. I'm sure many people have felt this at various points in the past, but it kind of feels like if we don't solve it in a decade, it's maybe not going to get solved, and then there's no more solving anything. And I mean, in reality, the whole process is going to be a lot slower than that. Like, even if, well, we won't be able to tell whether extinction is locked in until basically it's happened. But even if it is locked in, say, in a decade from now, it's going to take probably at least the better part of a century. And I think one of the things that helps me to keep in mind, and I think is a good perspective to have, I think, is that if we are fighting to make a better world and to, preserve a future for all of humanity, we are part of that. We're part of the humanity that has a right to a good life. And so it's sort of, I guess, ideologically consistent to work to make your own life good insofar as you are able, in addition to doing what you can for the future and for future people. And it's sort of, you yourself are deserving of that which you are fighting for other people.
Mm-hmm. To Greta Christina, self-care is not selfish. Take care of yourself first. Well, and also the standard the common analogy is to like oxygen masks on airplanes. They always will tell you put your mask on first. Why? Because you can't help other people if you can't breathe and you're unconscious. Do that first, even if you've got people you love and care about right next to you, people who would have difficulty putting on their own masks. Help yourself and then help others. It's a very easy thing to neglect, especially when you're dealing with systematic issues and such, which span everything. Oh yeah, and another approach that I think people tend to forget, and I sort of hinted at with the marathon analogy as well too, is taking care of your body is actually quite important. We have this sort of weird idea that the brain and body are separate, which completely false. No, the way you sort of think affect how the ways you react, and the ways you react can actually affect the ways you think in many ways. People can sort of get into a panic. This sort of narrows their ability to focus. They're not able to potentially take in the bigger picture, and thus, can make bad decisions and all that. So it's important to sort of take care of your body just as you would anything else. And this also sort of serves another problem. It solves another problem as well too, in that if you're sort of immersed entirely, for instance, in climate change, if that's all you do 24/7, that's just a recipe for disaster, because you're going to be surrounded by the doom and gloom, and you're going to have no way to sort of eject from it. What you should have is a variety of things that you engage in. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to get a little bit of exercise. Most of us probably have sedentary jobs. We're not actually sort of doing things. So getting out and going for like a jog or swim or something like that basically takes you out of your ordinary everyday, pulls you potentially out of that potential rut that you're in, and makes you sort of think and focus in a different way, which can be enough to really effectively combat burnout.
I will vouch for that. I've been trying to go hiking more often, not on the scale you do, HJ, but trying to walk a few miles when I can. And I'm lucky enough to have some beautiful countryside where I live. And, just being able to stride out, feel my body working, get the fresh air, feel the sunshine when there is any sunshine, which admittedly is not that often in Britain at this time of year, and just look at all the scenery. It's the perfect way to unwind. There's sort of getting the initial impetus to get up and do it, and I'm feeling exhausted after a hard day at work or whatever, but it's something I feel a lot better if I can manage to do.
Well, yeah, and take your forms of self-care and fit them into the things you've got. Again, if your day-to-day job is mostly thinking and a lot, do something as a pastime which doesn't require thinking. Oh, you're feeling exhausted. Well, just sit back and watch a movie. That's fine. And especially with things like exercise too, it's very easy to sort of go into, well, I'm going to be a total fitness nut and all that, or do some sort of CrossFit or something like that. No, no, no. People always overestimate how much exercise is necessary. People always say, well, I have to do X amount, otherwise I'm going to be fit. It really varies depending on person, and you'd be surprised just how little you can get away with. Again, especially when we're dealing with coping, ways to cope and deal with self-care, you don't need a lot. Just enough to sort of help clean out the cobwebs and help clean out your mind. Now, I mean, also just physical relaxation counts too on the other side. If going out for a jog, is one way to do it. Also, just not doing anything is a great way too. Taking a nap, I have tried to sort of get myself better at taking naps, for instance, just as another way to sort of handle these sorts of situations and, help keep my mind clear, especially since my day-to-day work does involve a fair bit of thought too. This can also tend to come in terms of relaxation exercises. When I was being taught meditation, there is sort of like a distinctive set of exercises which will help sort of relax your body. And unsurprisingly, just by focusing on doing those exercises correctly, it can sort of take your mind off, your worries, your other things and all that. It can act in and of itself as a break, even if you're not necessarily any less stressed, in the short term. It's something that's very quick and very easy to do, and it doesn't require, any sort of level of physical fitness or strength to pull off. It's a very handy thing to have in your toolkit. If no one else has got any other things, I was also thinking potentially food as an example too. And I mean, it can sort of vary over time. My past thing used to be like tea and chocolate, for instance, as a way to cope. Well, I've got tons of tea and chocolate around me. I've essentially burnt out on chocolate, if such a thing is possible. So, it's
But
just
I'm going to hold my hand up and say, no, I do not believe that such thing is possible. Sorry, I'm definitely challenging you on that one.
fair enough, fair enough.
Well, so I will say that for a good chunk of my life, I think food was more of an unhealthy coping mechanism for me. And honestly, a lot of what has moved me away from that, insofar as I have moved away from that, has just been food intolerances, which chocolate seems to be on the list now, except in very, very small amounts. Uh, but like, I think that when it comes to coping, food, like, there's food in terms of it's part of how we enjoy life is eating. Like, food, sex, drugs can all be part of a healthy life, but they can also all lend themselves to abuse, if they are your central coping mechanism. And it doesn't even really matter whether or not what you're doing is technically chemically addictive or anything like that. It's just, it is very easy to fall into an excess of something to the point where it starts to be harmful. And that's sort of another, I don't know, problem of being human, is that you have to sort of watch your coping mechanisms to make sure that they're not circling around and causing problems all over again.
Very good point. Yeah. And I mean, another way that food can be a way to cope is also just eating right, spending a little bit of extra time to sort of try and improve your diet and all that to make things a little bit better. Well, also allowing yourself to indulge every once in a while too. My plan for this
Yeah.
evening, for instance, is to have like a pizza or something. Or actually, no, I think I'll probably go for lasagna or something tonight. It's something I don't have very often, but it's a nice little way to sort of liven up my usual meals and all that, and make things a little bit more interesting.
Well, and the forcing myself to go on a more restricted diet for digestive reasons is also like, my health has improved at least a bit, and it does sort of help with energy and, I don't know, clarity of thought, for lack of a better term. Not that much apparently, but
Good enough, anyway. And again, there's the whole meditative thing of actually preparing food too. If you have the time and ability, don't just, try and get some sort of microwave meal you can throw in. See if there's something you can sort of sit down and prepare. Again, not necessarily on like a daily basis or anything like that, but just sit down and do the sort of the mechanical act of preparation. And again, if you're mostly sort of worried about sort of things within your head and all that, sitting down and doing something physical is a good way to sort of pull yourself out of it and potentially help stave off the side effects of burnout, for instance.
So there was one thing that occurred to me. There's a phenomenon on YouTube of reaction content, where like it's people who watch a show or a movie and film themselves watching it, and then people watch someone watching it. um and I got into that over the pandemic, and it didn't occur to me until a while later that it sort of, in a lot of ways, acts like a sort of replacement for having a social life in some ways, in that you get the experience of, or something very akin to the experience of showing a piece of media that you like to someone else and seeing them enjoy it. And it's sort of, I don't know, I've had a blog post and sort of bouncing around in the back of my head for a while now about sort of the kind of, I don't know, it relates, I'm sure, to, alienation under capitalism and the sort of general loneliness epidemic that people are dealing with in general. But it's sort of fascinating to me that this form of entertainment has arisen that is sort of intensely parasocial, like as a lot of this content is, but also I don't know, it's weird. And it's sort of, I think it is a bit of a coping mechanism. Like I think it has been for me at various points in the last few years. Um, and it's one of those ones where it's hard to tell whether it's a useful coping mechanism or something that, distracts you from more healthy ways to deal with things, or somewhere in between. But it's sort of, I've been thinking, we'd mentioned pets being a form of coping earlier when my cat was making his presence known, and for some reason that bounced my brain onto reaction content and just sort of, well, probably because he's usually sitting here when I'm watching that sort of thing. But coping options have changed as the world has changed as well, which, also bring in gaming and things like that.
Yeah,
I
and
guess I don't
again,
really have anywhere to go with that thread, but
there's not one magical thing which will help you cope with everything. It's important to have a variety of ways to sort of go about it and potentially to sort of change things up. I already mentioned my tea and chocolate thing and all that, but there are various things which, come and go to sort of help you cope with things. I used to play Minecraft a lot. I play it very little now, I keep saying, oh yeah, no, I'm going to try and get back into it and all that. And I mean, it is very nice and meditative, but it's just not sort of providing that same sort of kick in the way it was before. Same with YouTube videos as well. I will sometimes just sort of sit down. Oh, hey, I found like an interesting genre of YouTube video. And I'll just sit down and watch the bunch. And it gives me sort of like again, that sort of sense of community. Also of emotional release, too. When someone pulls off something they didn't think was possible. Like I'm thinking in particular of, I think there's the person who actually used to like solve Sudoku puzzles on their channel, and they're confronted with one which had like I think literally like one number sort of filled in, and a bunch of other constrained rules. And they spent like the first half of the video saying, "Oh, this is impossible. This is impossible. There's no way it can happen. There's no way you can actually kind of solve this." And then gradually they're sort of like, "Wait, maybe it's possible." And then eventually by the very end, they're practically beside themselves going, "Oh my goodness, I figured it out. I actually worked it out." That sort of reflected joy can be a very handy thing, especially if you can't necessarily find any sort of joy within your own circumstances. You just can't, bring that up on demand. Well, go on to like an old movie, a YouTube channel or something like that, and see if you can find someone else's joy, which you can get sort of like a reflexive, you can soak in reflexively. And that might serve the same purpose.
it it actually, like, if anybody's interested in something very relevant to what HJ just said, I just thought of it. H Bomber Guy did a video on speed running in video games, and as with most of his stuff, it is pretty long, but it gets into that thing a bit where it's a way to sort of see, you know, when you get towards the end of a successful speed run and someone's breaking a record after putting thousands and thousands of hours into it, you suddenly start to see why this might be worth it to someone, and you start to feel that, thanks to our, nice mirror neurons and the ability to sort of resonate with what we see other people going through. So yeah, it's a good point.
That's also an example of like a
There's
small
something
victory.
so cool about seeing someone else's enthusiasm. I find even if it's something I know nothing about myself, I love reading or hearing or seeing how someone else feels about it, why they're enthusiastic about it.
Very agreed. Yeah. I mean, it sort of brings up another sort of a thing we can talk about as well. It'd be like hobbies and that. Speedrunning again is a hobby, and it's a way to sort of take your mind off and focus on something else, especially with video games. They have sort of like an artificial constructed world with various rules and all that, some of which are fairly abstract, some of which, vaguely resemble what we've got. But it creates like a little toy sandbox you can actually use to sort of play around and almost get like a better sense of control if you yourself feel like you don't have that sense of control in real life. And again, the sort of emotional hits that sort of come with hitting various, conquests or scores or whatever associated with that. So yeah, that can be a very valuable thing to sort of hobbies in general actually can be very valuable for that because you've got, again, your little sandbox universe you can play within. And this occurs pretty much everywhere. I mean, not just, speed running video games and all that, but, things like woodworking, an old standby hobby and all that, gardening. These are all great ways to actually sort of cope with stressful situations, because they get your head out of the game and because they get you thinking in other ways. Oftentimes, I'll actually find that it's when I step back from something that I actually come up with better solutions to things. The whole thing, sometimes the best ideas I have are just sort of standing in the shower. This is why, when you're sort of not focused and letting your mind wander, sometimes the best ideas can come to you. And this sort of gets to the choice of hobby as well, too. You can pick something that you're sort of really great at and all that, but sometimes it can also be great just to sort of start from nothing and sort of face that struggle. It all sort of depends on what sort of thing you're looking for. Sometimes just the act of struggle and doing difficult things can be rewarding in and of itself. Classic example, for instance, is the Dark Souls games. They are very difficult. They have a very steep learning curve, but people take quite a bit of enjoyment in actually just sitting down and trying to figure it out. To go from somebody who dies practically instantly to being able to survive, 10, 20 minutes or something like that, it can be very rewarding. The key thing to underline all that, though, is it's something you have to be able to enjoy. Again, sort of depending on what you're trying to cope with, it can be great to have something very difficult, but it can also be great to have something very easy to deal with, too. We're not sort of difficulty shaming here or anything. If you really got to sort of sit back and play a game on the easiest mode possible or use cheat codes, perfectly fine. You're just there to enjoy things, you're there for the scenery, and there is nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
Yeah, I two games that I enjoy playing. Well, the main one is a Total War Shogun, which is a conquering Japan during the period of war, the era of warring states, and I have never beaten it on anything except easy mode, and I almost never try to go out of easy mode on that one. But it's just like sometimes easy mode is just what you need. Like same as people play solitaire to relax or just bounce a ball off a wall.
Yeah, very true. It's the little things. And I mean, especially, I think you're referring to that scene in The Great Escape where, what's his name? Sort of copes with being in solitary confinement by just tossing a ball against the wall. That simple
I
mechanical
wasn't,
act.
but that's a good example.
Yes. Yeah, it's maybe showing my age a little bit, but yeah, it's one way to cope. And oftentimes, especially when things seem the most dire, the most despairing and all that, it can sometimes be the littlest things that bring us the greatest joy. So don't, sell those short or look at that. You've got to sort of go out and figure out what exactly brings you that joy. And very carefully space it out in small doses so you don't get distracted from the actual things you've got to deal with.
Although one thing I will say is that if you do take up woodworking or anything else that involves carving, uh, cut away from your hand.
Mm-hmm.
Don't cut towards your hand because that's a good way to
Definitely
end up with
noted.
stitches.
Indeed. You got to have some focus.
Yeah, in general, try to avoid injuring yourself. I realize.
Yeah, don't self-harm as one of your hobbies, either deliberately or accidentally.
Well, I honestly, it's probably like I hadn't really thought of it until now, but like that is a form of coping that some people engage in that probably is good to avoid.
Mm,
But like
yeah.
they're well, like I was thinking about, um, I've been toying with the idea of joining a local boxing club, not to actually start boxing. All they really do is just work on, bags and stuff. I think some of them box a little, but I wasn't planning on actually fighting anyone. But like, it's one of those things where I don't know. I have had satisfaction in just, punching a punching bag, but also at rough times in my life, doing so without gloves, hurt. And there's a weird kind of satisfaction to that. And it's not, well, I would say it's not worth it, and it's not healthy, I don't think. Um, to, I think if you're at that point, you're seeking some kind of stimulation, and it's probably better to see if you can find another way. But
This is true.
Yeah, it's like it's like on some level your brain is sending a message to itself that you're worth the hurt, that's all that you're worth, and that can be quite a negative message to be sending to yourself, to be reinforcing for yourself.
Agreed. Oh yeah, one thing as well that is worth sort of keeping in mind is self-awareness. I mean, if you don't even realize you're burned out, there's no way you're going to actually be able to cope with burnout itself. So a lot of these sort of self-care strategies actually rely on you knowing yourself and knowing what works best for you. If you're not one who actually will do any sort of self-care unless you actually schedule it in and all that, schedule it in. If you're a person who feels that that's just sort of weird and artificial and you shouldn't actually sort of schedule things that tightly and all that, well, don't. Sort of deal with it the way that yourself sort of goes into it, and be very careful with what you do. This is actually something which is a major theme amongst Greta Christina's talk on Activist Burnout and all that. She sort of points out that she'd rather have somebody say, no, I'm not in a good shape to do this sort of thing, than say, okay, fine, I'll help out and do sort of like a half-assed job at it. It's better to be honest with yourself and not even sort of put the effort forward if you don't think you're actually going to be able to put the best effort that you can, or potentially even sort of like a useful amount of effort. You've got to sort of know what your own limits are, know when to stop, and know when to sort of pick up and continue forward.
I think an analogy for that, honestly, is when I took wilderness first responder training years ago. One of the things they point out is before you go into a situation where somebody's injured, you have to actually check the landscape, because the worst possible thing that you can do as a first responder is to get yourself injured and become another person who then needs more first responders to get out. And that applies to mental injury as well, psychological injury, and like if you're going to go into there are situations that I will avoid because I know if I go into them, I'm not going to be as helpful. Like I might become someone that needs to be helped, and then that's more work for any other activist who's there. And sort of finding that balance is important, and looking out for hazards that might be unique to you. A tree is going to fall on anybody who's under it, but sometimes we've got our own trees, so to speak.
Very true. Yeah, well, I did, as is my want, actually do a little bit of research, and it's very easy to sort of pop a couple of terms into Google Scholar and say, hey, what sort of research has sort of come up on this? And there does seem to be a decent amount, although a lot of it is sort of dated from like the 80s or 90s, so it doesn't look like the field has advanced too much in the past couple of decades. But you can imagine that, counselors and all that to deal with this on a fairly extreme level. They not only have their own problems to deal with, they also have a lot of other people's problems that they have to deal with, most of whom, if they're in a counselor's office, those problems are bad enough that, they're sort of above the norm in terms of what people sort of cope with. And so you can imagine, seeing how these counselors deal with having this avalanche of other people's, problems sort of land on their doorstep. How they cope with that is actually a good way, to sort of figure out how you can cope with your own lesser problems, potentially. Might give you some ideas on that. I did actually track down a paper, actually dated 2009, I'll say, Preventing vicarious trauma of mental health therapists. I didn't bother sort of going through all of it because, I mean, a lot of what they sort of say actually sort of reflects what we've been talking about before. Again, these strategies I think are fairly well known overall. The difficulty is not actually figuring out the strategies, it's just putting them into practice, figuring out what's best for you and what you can actually sort of do and implement within your own life itself. There are, however, some interesting things which came up, which I would not normally sort of think of as something which you could think of as a coping mechanism. And one thing, interestingly, they found is that actually their own work was a way to sort of help them cope with their work. I think the idea essentially was by helping other people make progress, they can help essentially sort of help themselves make progress. It's sort of feeling better about yourself by helping other people feel better about themselves. It's sort of, again, sort of reflected glory of this kind of thing. And
I can relate to that as a GP. That my experience is, yes, my work is mentally exhausting. I found in some ways it's actually a stress reliever. I found at times in my life when other stuff in my life has been overwhelming and I've felt like I'm not coping well with it, it's good to be able to spend a, a good several hours doing something that I know I'm actually pretty competent at. It's satisfying to know that, pretty much every working day of my life, I can look back and think, well, I made somebody's day a bit better, or I made somebody's life a bit better today. Sometimes it's just a lot of the time, it's just a small thing like being able to reassure them, or a practical thing like being able to refer them where they want to be referred. But, there is always something positive I can look back on about my day and what I've accomplished. And also, it's fantastic for perspective. I'll go into work feeling sorry for myself, and I can guarantee I will see someone who's worse off than I am and struggling with more stuff. So, for all those reasons, I've actually found my work very good for my mental health. It's something that just, it's given my life meaning and purpose, to be cliched about it. So, yeah, I can very much relate to what you're saying.
yeah,
I think the challenge that a lot of people face who don't have jobs that necessarily directly, I mean, you hear about bullshit jobs, and like part of the alienation I think a lot of people feel at a systemic level is the degree to which they feel like most of their energy goes towards stuff that doesn't help anyone in any meaningful way.
Mm.
And I think one of the problems I faced, not to bring it back to myself all the time, but is just that like it's difficult to find ways to materially help people that are sort of within your means when it's not a job. Like I think I spent a good chunk of my life looking for jobs that I thought were helpful to the world in some way, and um those are sort of at a premium. Like they're not always easy to find, or they take a huge amount of work to get. Um, and so it's sort of one of the big challenges I think of our time is figuring out how to do things that are useful around figuring out how to survive and how to
Yeah,
feel like what you're doing is enough. I guess what it
I
is.
think there's a lot to that, but I also think it's important enough to feel like you're doing something meaningful in the world that makes a difference, that it is worth thinking about how to do it within within the
Yeah,
context of what you can do. I mean, what I do is not particularly dramatic about everything. It's not or anything. It's just basically lots of small ways of helping people. But yeah, okay. And I also take on board that you can't always get a job that's helping people at all. And I think, it's worth being broader in your sense of what's going to be a job helping people. Maybe your way of making someone's day better is to be the helpful shop assistant who finds a video game that they want that they're going to go home and enjoy playing. Maybe it's being the waitress who brings them their food. Maybe it's something else that helps in some way, or maybe your job isn't doing anything to help people and you need to find some other way to help, like volunteering or donating money or doing something like that. I mean, you know, there's we've been talking about how important it is to not do too much and not burn yourself out, which I am completely behind. But at the same time, it can be just as important to be doing something, even if it's not very much, to find some way in which you're doing something positive with your life, so that you're not stuck in this loop of thinking, I'm a waste of space and really what good am I doing, so that you can actually think about some good that you're doing.
It's reminiscent of a sort of a branch of psychology I heard of known as logotherapy. It was started up by I think his name is Viktor Frankl, but essentially he was a Jew during Germany in the 1930s. Yay. Which meant he actually wound up spending some time in a concentration camp. And while he was within there, he noticed that the people who actually tend to get out of it, who tend to survive in those situations, weren't necessarily the strongest, the fittest, the craftiest, the cunningest, and all the cunningest and all that. It was the people who actually found a way to find meaning within their lives, to sort of find a way to sort of push forward to the next day and overcome what they had. And this is actually something which came up within that paper I was citing as well. Is you've got to find some way to sort of create meaning within your life. Find something that you find is worthwhile and worth doing. And if you don't have that, well, sit down and figure out what it is. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the thing you expect. It doesn't have to be your day job, your salary. It can be your hobby, whatever it is. You have to find that little spark that helps keep you moving forward, essentially. Yeah, another interesting thing that came up within this paper that I hadn't thought of is some counselors actually found it was important to embrace complexity and an openness to the unknown. Now, unfortunately, I didn't read through deep enough to sort of know what they're kind of getting at. But I've a couple of times I've sort of alluded to, creativity and ways of sort of finding wonder within the world and all that. And that's kind of a good point. If you're sort of stuck within a rut, just sort of doing the same thing over and over again, it's very easy to sort of quickly burn out and not sort of be able to do what you want to do. Essentially, you need some way to actually find some variance, some find some sort of change within your life to actually go through and potentially find solutions. And especially when it comes to burnout and all that, it can be very difficult to actually figure out what works best for you. Well, this is where being creative and open to change can potentially help with that. It makes you more likely to try different strategies and potentially stumble on that one way which works best for you, or the one way that works best for you right now. So I think that's what they're sort of getting at with that. The other ones that they bring up as well are maintaining clear boundaries, which, I mean, always good. If your stressor is your job and you're trying to find ways to cope with that, having sort of a very strict, I am not going to deal with work stuff outside of work kind of thing is a great way to sort of help cope with that. And they also mention here the idea of ritual as well too, which, I mean, being a bunch of atheists and me and all that. But I mean, this also sort of comes down to, like playing video games as a form of ritual or something like that. Finding just,
So,
the oh, sorry.
oh, I got very into for a little while just sort of the idea of ritual as a very secular concept of daily practices. So like I think it was possibly Twyla Tharp who had said that sort of her morning ritual is waking up, making coffee, and taking her coffee in the to go cup to get in a cab, which then takes her to the dance studio where she starts her work, and sort of that process doing the same thing every day ritualistically, um, and giving herself that time, and some of it is the investment in the cab ride, um, but like that sort of chunk of time being sort of all the same setting up, and I didn't get all the way through the book, but I believe it was her who had a book on forming rituals and the sort of the daily habits that you can erect around you. I've had a lot of difficulty forming that, but it's sort of, I think, well established as a very sort of secular way of basically working within your brain's need for patterns and normalcy, and a sort of in preparation for some of the things that you need to do.
Agreed. Right, I think we're about hitting the end of our time as well, too. So we should sort of wrap up here. I don't know if you've got any sort of ideas for resources or other things to potentially look at. I've actually referenced an old talk from Greta Christina on activist burnout a couple of times. There is, a good, there is a YouTube link to it, although I think the audio quality isn't the best, but it's certainly worth checking out. I don't know, let's actually, let's say again, Sarah, do a wrap up to sort of point you back to your blog, as well as sort of anything you could think of potentially as like a resource people who are interested in this could potentially look at.
Um, Sorry, I didn't quite catch what you were saying. Were you asking me to talk about my blog, or were you because in fact my blog's this ties in well, because my blog is actually one of the major ways in which I decompress. And I do sometimes feel guilty about this, because I feel like, well, it's my social justice blog, and I should be going out there with calls to arms and articles on the evils of the world that will stir people into action. And actually, what I do on there is book deconstructions, which can in their own way be social justice things, because for example, I'm on and off deconstructing an absolutely terrible romantic novel, just to look at the ways in which bad romance novels can be very, very toxic and put across a harmful view of relationships. And so in a way, I see it as a sort of socially positive service that I'm doing, but it's also great fun just to be able to say, oh my god, this bit of writing is so bad, and to poke fun at it. And what I also do on there, because it is something I am geeky enough to find relaxing, and I've mentioned this before, is I discuss the whole idea of Jesus mythicism, the concept of, was Jesus ever a real person who existed, or was he actually a myth from the start? And I get involved in these debates precisely because in this world where there are so many debates with absolute life or death crucial consequences to us, to people's quality of lives, to people's actual lives, to the planet, it is incredibly relaxing just to be able to get into very heated debates about something that does not matter in the slightest. I will, I'll occasionally have people asking me, or saying to me, well, for goodness sake, this doesn't matter. Like that's supposed to be a bug rather than a feature. Of course it doesn't matter. That is the joy of it. Yeah, those are the things I do on my blog, and that is one of my big ways of de-stressing.
That's nice. So two birds with one stone. I like that. All right, Abe, you look like you had something in mind as well
Yeah.
yourself.
So two things. One, another two books occurred to me. One is one that is actually on my shelf, which is called Active Hope: How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy, by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnstone. I haven't read this in years, but it gets into a lot of the active part of Active Hope is a lot of what you guys were talking about, with both finding a way to make a difference and finding a way to feel like you're at least doing something for the problems that are getting you down, at a societal level. The other one, just on the concept of rituals, I believe the book is called Daily Rituals, but there's a book out there that's just a collection of the daily habits of a whole swath of creative people, from Beethoven to Benjamin Franklin to writers and so on. And it ranges from, people who have, well, Benjamin Franklin and his daily air baths, to, I forget her name, but a writer who'd wake up and, drink a section of a vodka bottle before she started writing or getting out of bed. Like the whole gamut of, different ways people had these rituals, both constructive and destructive. And
Okay,
it's
can I
very,
just say that is a very, very bad idea for
oh
a coping
yeah,
ritual? That's an
yes,
example of
no,
the coping ritual you actively want to avoid. Sorry, do
I
go
do
on.
not condone, but it's I think interesting as like these are all people that society has in various ways recognized as successful in their field, and it's interesting to see the huge breadth of ways in which they approached life. And when you're in a bad place, sometimes it's nice to see that somebody else who was also in a bad place still managed to produce something of value for the world. um, Albeit still, in my opinion, worth trying to get out of that bad place. I don't really like to glorify the struggling artist and all those tropes, but and yeah, I'm on free thought blog / oceanoxia, and I don't know how much the blog helps me cope versus being destructive to my mental well-being, but that's where you can find me, and well, I think it helps more than it hurts. So yeah, that's my bit.
Yeah, another reason for me to get back into blogging too is to just be able to vent that things. I've got a number of topics I actually want to vent on, so hopefully at some point I'll find some free time. But if you want to see my blogging output, it is over Reprobate Spreadsheet on Free Thought Blogs as well. I did invoke Frankel's book on logotherapy. That might be sort of an interesting spot to look at. But again, as I've sort of hinted at multiple times, Greta Christina's talk on Atheist Burn-out, I think, is definitely the best sort of summary of this sort of thing. And I think it gives you plenty of good ideas and tips to sort of go with. And she just sort of rapidly goes through another ways to sort of cope with that. All right, I think with that we are finished for today. So we shall be leaving you until we talk next time. So see you around.